Today, we have the stories of three African American communities and how racism led to the destruction of those communities. And if you have questions that you would like to ask me, you can do so at onemichistory.com in the contacts page. Also, if you want to support the channel, you can do so on my Buy Me Coffee on my Patreon page in the description below. Don't forget to give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and support the YouTube channel. But without further ado, let's get started. Did you know that before there was Central Park, there was the primarily African-American community of Seneca Village? 1825, white farmers John and Elizabeth Whitehead divided up their land into 200 parcels and sold them. Andrew Williams, a 25-year-old African-American shoe shiner, purchased the first 3 lots for $125. Epiphany Davis, a store clerk, bought 12 lots for $578. Additionally, an African-American Methodist Episcopal Zion Church purchased 6 lots. This marked the beginning of Seneca Village, an African-American community that grew quickly over the next few years. By 1832, there were roughly 10 homes in the village, with the Whiteheads selling off half of their parcels to other African-Americans. During the Great Famine in Ireland in the mid-1800s, Seneca Village's population grew by 30%, largely comprised of Irish immigrants. Despite the social and racial conflict elsewhere in the city between the two groups, Irish and African Americans lived in Seneca Village in close proximity to one another. For African Americans in Seneca Village, it was a place of refuge from the discrimination and overcrowded conditions in New York City. Compared to other African Americans living in the city, the residents of Seneca Village were more stable and prosperous. By 1855, about half of the village inhabitants owned their own homes, giving them a level of security and rights not shared by most African Americans within the city. One of the rights was the right to vote, which was granted them upon meeting New York State by 1821 requirements of owning at least $250 worth of property and holding residency there for at least 3 years. Of the 100 black voters in New York City that were eligible to vote in 1845, 10 of them were residents in Seneca Village. During that same time in the early 1800s, New York City's population saw a rapid expansion. As the city's noise and chaos grew, its citizens increasingly sought ways to escape the city's chaos. At the time, most of the city's green spaces were cemeteries, which were seeing large crowds of people who wanted to spend their spare time closer to nature by walking, picnicking, and other outdoor activities. Additionally, affluent New Yorkers advocated for the establishment of a grand park within the city. During the 1850s, the city of New York started a plan for a large public park as a response to the unhealthy environment of the city and as a source for recreational activities. As a result, the New York State Legislature passed a law in 1853 reserving 750 acres of land from 59th Street to 106th Street and from 5th Avenue all the way to 8th Avenue, making it the first major landscaped public park in the United States. As construction of Central Park grew near to Seneca Village, the newspapers and politicians began to characterize Seneca Village as a shanty town and called the inhabitants then citizens, squatters, vagabonds, and scoundrels. The citizens of Seneca Village worked to protect their homes and the community, yet in 1857, the city used their power of eminent domain to evict them. This law allows the government to take property for public use from the landowner after receiving financial compensation. Police officers were sent to forcibly remove the individuals who refused to leave. This removal resulted in the displacement of over 1,600 individuals who had previously lived in the area. Despite offering compensation, many of the affected people argued that the amount they received was wholly inadequate. By the end of 1857, all of the residents had been forced to move, and today research is being done into where the inhabitants of Seneca Village was relocated to. Some evidence suggests that they may have gone to other African-American communities, such as the Sandy Ground in Staten Island or Skunk Hollow in New Jersey. The second story tonight is about Bruce's Beach and how the city of Manhattan Beach used eminent domain to remove a black community. Are you familiar with the story of Bruce's Beach? In 1912 and 1920, Charles and Willa Bruce purchased 2 lots of land along a strand of Manhattan Beach for $1,200. Like many African Americans, the Bruce's family had moved west during the Great Migration to seek better opportunities and to participate in the promise of California and the American dream. Shortly after purchasing the land, the Bruce's turned the location into a seaside resort called Bruce's Lodge that welcomed Black beachgoers from all over Los Angeles, and the area became known as Bruce's Beach. The Manhattan Beach area, though, was a predominantly white community, and as the Los Angeles population increased, the property values soared going into the 1920s. Many white residents of the surrounding community reacted with hostility and racism. Meanwhile, the resort gained popularity amongst Black beachgoers, and other families purchased land and lots near Bruce's Beach. Some built vacation homes and established the beginning of a modest, diverse community on Manhattan Beach. However, in 1924, prompted by a petition from local white residents, Manhattan Beach City Council voted to condemn Bruce's Beach's site and use eminent domain to acquire the surrounding properties, including some of the Black-owned businesses, to build a park. Eminent domain is the government or an agent's right to private property for public use with payment or compensation. The couple was sued for $120,000, which included $35,000 for each lot and $50,000 in damages. In 1929, they settled for $14,500. It's well documented that the reason behind the eminent domain process was racially motivated with the intent to bring an end to the successful business and thwart any other African Americans from settling or developing in Manhattan Beach. City ordinances were passed to prohibit resort-type businesses in the area and effectively prohibited Bruce and other Black families from purchasing additional beachfront properties in the area. Also passed prohibit dressing and undressing in vehicles on the street, public places or in tents, and parking restrictions were implemented to harass and prohibit African American visitation to Bruce's Beach's shoreline area. Afterwards, the Bruce family was left destitute by the land seizure and was forced to move out of Manhattan Beach area in 1927. They then moved to East LA, where they spent the rest of their lives working as cooks and local diners. The city immediately demolished Bruce's Beach Resort, and the land would sit empty for decades. The city of Manhattan Beach didn't build a park until 1956, almost 30 years later. Over the years, the park was called by many different names. It wasn't until Manhattan Beach, first Black councilman and mayor Mitch Ward, along with other local citizens, led to renaming effort of Bruce's Beach in 2007. Through a series of land transfers through the city of Manhattan Beach to the state of California to the county of Los Angeles, LA County acquired the land in 1995. But in 2001, the county began the process of returning ownership to the descendants of the Bruces. On April 20th, 2021, LA Council supervisors unanimously voted to approve the returning of county land to the family's descendants. However, due to the series of land transfers, a restriction required Los Angeles County to use Bruce's Beach for public recreation and prevented the county from transferring or selling the property without state legislation. On June 2nd, 2021, the California State Senate approved a bill allowing for the return of the property to Bruce's descendants. January 2023, the family of the Bruces informed the County of LA of their decision to sell Bruce's Beach back to LA County for $20 million. And the final story tonight is about the Mill Creek Valley and how the city of St. Louis used urban renewal to remove 20,000 African Americans from their community and to build the Gateway Arch. Have you ever heard the story of the Gateway Arch and the Black community of Mill Creek? Now, the Gateway Arch is the nation's tallest national monument. It stands at 630 feet and is crafted from 800 tons of stainless steel. The arch is a feat of precision engineering with two legs that join in the middle with the accuracy of 1/60th of an inch. And you would expect, with a project like this, there would be some racism involved. 1910, African Americans moved from southern states and began the Great Migration to the neighborhood that would become the Mill Creek Valley. By the 1920s, the area had become a hub for an African American community and the working middle class. It became one of the largest African American communities in the nation in the first half of the 20th century, spanning 400 acres and homes to hundreds of businesses, organizations, 5,500 residential buildings by the 1950s. But the legacy of redlining and segregation had devastating effects on the neighborhood. Many of the buildings lacked water and electricity, and by the middle of the 20th century, it had become one of the least desirable places to live within the city. 1934, local business leaders promoted the idea of a memorial to Thomas Jefferson and his expansionary vision of the Louisiana Purchase. But their real aim was to get rid of the city's waterfront blighted property and bring in federal construction dollars. Following a controversial bond measure that passed that allowed for the demolition of 40 blocks of riverside property that included 400 businesses, the Post-Dispatch announced that the project was election thievery, and the Interior Secretary Harold Ickes objected to it, stating that it was speculative real estate. However, World War II would disrupt public works projects, and money wouldn't begin flowing until Harry Truman was elected president. Still, the area was left in disarray for more than a decade until the interstate system of highways was approved by Dwight Eisenhower. This included a stretch that passed along the site and renewed appeal for a project of an outsized attraction for many Americans to see as they passed by in their cars. As plans to develop the Gateway Arch emerged in the 30s, so did plans for a low-rent subsidized housing. The Housing Act of 1954 was enacted to fund urban renewal projects across the country. August 7, 1954, Mayor Raymond Tucker announced his plan to demolish existing structures to make way for new development. In 1955, St. Louis voters approved a $110 million bond issue, with $100 million designated solely for the destruction of the Black community of Mill Creek Valley. The urban renewal project included construction of residential buildings, the creation of industrial zones, the building of new highways that included the building of U.S. Highway 40. It was the most expensive urban renewal project in the nation at the time, and ultimately, 20,000 African Americans were displaced in order to make room for this urban renewal project that began in 1955. Then, the highway system continued to cause damage to the African American population of St. Louis because they were cut off from the development that was taking place around the Gateway Arch, and racial tensions were already heightened because construction unions had barred African Americans from working on the site. During the 60s, subsidized housing was developed in the Mill Creek Valley with some success. But by the late 70s, the area had not lived up to developers' expectations. As of now, much of the Mill Creek Valley neighborhood consists of vacant lots. This has been OneMicHistory.com. I'm your host, Country Boy. If you like stories like this, you can find more stories like this at OneMicHistory.com. Also, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so on my Buy Me Coffee and Patreon page in the description below. Give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, and peace.